Welcome to the Touch MBA Admissions Podcast. Do you need help figuring out which schools to apply to or how to get into the world's top MBA programs? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others on this podcast and on our site, touchmba.com, as they seek the admissions edge. And now, here's your host, Darren Joe.
Hey guys, it's Darren here and welcome to the show. I'm really excited for this week's episode because here at the Touch MBA podcast, we want to help you figure out which schools fit you best, and we want to help you get in to those best fit schools. And this week I spoke with Ben Parker, who actually came to Touch MBA for free school selection help back in May 2015 and recently got into both London Business School and HKUST in Hong Kong. And so in this episode, we walk through Ben's journey, and he shares, his best advice in terms of researching schools, how he shortlisted his schools, how he spoke to students and alumni and admission staff at his target schools, what to ask these different people, and how he made his story shine, or as he says, how he made his story glow. Ben really poured his soul into the B School application process, and I think many of you will be able to relate to his journey and his ups and downs, and I think you'll get a lot of great tips and encouragement from this episode, so let's get straight to it. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Darren. I've got to pinch myself that I'm actually participating in this podcast because I've listened to, I think, almost all of your podcasts and didn't think I'd be participating. So it's great to be here.
It's so awesome to have you. So Ben came to our site in May of last year, 2015, and I just want to do a quick recap. Ben, you came to the site looking for school selection help, and at the time, you were looking for schools at top U.S. business schools, top European business schools that help you leverage your experience in frontier markets to work for a company who needs to negotiate with the government in a highly regulated industry such as telecom or energy. So could you just give a quick introduction of your background for our listeners?
So as you briefly mentioned, I do have a background in government and public policy. My undergraduate degree is in political economics, and I have a master's in public policy. I also have about 7 years experience working as a ministerial policy advisor in the areas of transport, education, and most recently in health. To add to that, in 2013, with a few colleagues, I co-founded the Australia-Myanmar Chamber of Commerce and have built that to an organisation where we represent the public policy and also the commercial interests of some of Australia's largest companies in the new and exciting frontier market that is Myanmar. So I, as you mentioned, I did come to Touch MBA with basically the broadest remit of what schools I should go to in May last year. At that stage, I was looking at, every top 10 school in the US, every international MBA. Was a little bit lost, so that's why I came to Touch MBA for some insight into what kind of suited my profile the most.
And how else did you go about researching schools and exploring options? And what I'm really trying to get at is, what 20% of your activities were the most helpful for you in terms of narrowing down that universe of business schools?
For me, it was a real organic process. I've written a few notes about just to try and get my thoughts around how I did it, because it just seems like I was doing it forever last year. And I can understand listeners just thinking that this is just never going to end and, I'm never going to get in somewhere. There's so many criteria that I have to meet. I've got to show fit to every different school and how am I going to be able to do that? So I think it might be helpful if I just explain how I went about it. But,
awesome.
I work about 20 minutes from my house by walk, and I'd use that walk. I'd have in my bag, my GMAT books that I was, diligently studying at lunchtime and in coffee breaks and whenever I could get some free time. But I'd also have on the iPhone the Touch MBA podcast and other podcasts, but the Touch MBA one was just more clear for me. And I hadn't narrowed down any school, and so I used those podcasts and that information just to get an idea of what admissions directors were talking about and what students were talking about, and kind of where their focus was. And I made it my mission to just devour as much material on MBA programs, not necessarily anyone in particular, devour as much material as possible. And so I listened to how these admission directors would talk about their school, and I noticed that a lot of the schools didn't talk about curriculum or how they were structured, but more about their location was really important. It defined a lot of the schools, what their career outcomes looked like, and also more importantly, what the quality of and background of their students was. And so that kind of started to guide me into how I was thinking about approaching a school and what schools would be best for me. So it was really, really important for me to get an idea about how they saw their schools and how I should go about researching. So at that stage, it was about March where I did the first kind of GMAT prep and first research considerations. And so I started to send a few emails just to people who didn't have MBAs. A lot of in Australia, the MBA is still an unknown commodity, especially international MBAs. They're very unknown, and there's not many people in my networks that actually have MBAs. But I sent out a few feelers to people in my network who are in private equity or consulting or even startups, and just got their initial thoughts on how's this school in Asia or how's this school in London or the US? What are there any people from in your workplace that have been there or have MBAs, and where are they from? And those first initial discussions were really really broad, but also really beneficial in telling me that I have, for example, I approached a few friends in private equity and consulting, and they even mentioned that a couple on my shortlist in the UK they didn't recruit at all from there. So that was a quick way to kind of cut down on that school. So I first started by doing that research and really exposing myself to their online materials, podcasts, brochures, and started to speak. That's when I first started to speak to a few people who were in the kind of industry. But in terms of the 20%, I've been thinking about the 20%, and I've just got to say that it's definitely living and breathing the business school process, which in itself is interesting and exciting for the first few months. But when you're 9 months in, and your fiance is on a holiday with you, and you've got the headphones in listening to podcasts, it's
don't tell her you are listening to me, okay?
Yeah, it's not the most beneficial for that relationship, but it really helped me to craft a story. And when I was nowhere near applying by this stage, I was 6 months out from applying. I hadn't even done the GMAT, but I was really crafting my story already. So that's maybe, I would say, the top 10%, and then and after that, in the 20% of research, talking to students, talking to alumni, talking to admission staff. I know everyone says it, but it really is important. It not only gives you great insight into the school, and it gives the admissions staff. You should treat it like an interview every time you talk to an admissions staff. You've really got to impress them. That doesn't mean you have to rattle off all your qualifications, but just by the way you communicate, if you're clear, concise, to the point, know what you want out from it, from that conversation, it's really beneficial. I think talking to students, staff, and alumni also is in that top 20%.
So yeah, I can't wait to delve deeper into how you did that. But when you said that part of that top 10, 20% for you was breathing the B school process, what exactly do you mean by that?
I literally mean, every free moment that I had. I won't say that I was doing it at work, but potentially I may have been doing it at work. Reading through forums, reading through some of the materials that the business schools have out there, looking at the exchange programs for some of the key schools that I wanted to go to, and just getting an idea of how they present themselves in this online world. It really made a big difference. The brochures are important. And if you're not taken by a brochure, it's indicative that perhaps you don't have a connection with that school. If their online presence isn't amazing as another school, then maybe that shows something to you as well. For me, there was a couple of schools that I was looking at that didn't really have an online presence, and there wasn't much chatter around them. And I thought, well, maybe that just shows how they're going to be with recruiting in Asia. If online, they're only, they have got a really good reputation in Europe, but maybe Asia, it's not as strong. They don't have that online presence. So it just kind of built up the story about where I wanted to go and what schools I wanted to go. At this stage, I'd eliminated going to any US schools just because you've got to think about your own personal circumstances, and having a partner who wanted to come with me on this MBA journey. Working there was a bit out of the question, just with visa restrictions and the locations I was looking at just didn't suit her. So that kind of struck it out, and you've got to be realistic about that. That's a really important thing to realize, that you can't go to every business school. It's nice to have all these different aspirations, but you've got to be realistic about what suits you and your situation.
So one question there. Could you tell our audience what was your career goal? What did you want to do after your MBA? What do you want to do?
Sure. So coming from my background as in public policy, I have a real passion for public policy. I have a real passion for the highest levels of government. I've advised ministers of education, transport, and health, primarily around funding policy. So how do governments fund these social policies and get value for money for taxpayers? So combining that with my advocacy in Myanmar and my work with the Chamber of Commerce, it made sense for me to start to look at the intersection between government and the private sector, and because there's really great opportunities in the private sector to make an impact on social outcomes, and also engage with government to really boost commercial practices, and also provide some really good opportunities for the local people in Myanmar and around the world. So my career goal was, and still is to a certain extent, was to join a company, a large company that was looking to establish its presence in an emerging market in Asia or elsewhere. And a lot of that work has to do with engaging with the government, because it's all often early stages. The government is often quite unskilled. In Myanmar in particular, it's been years of neglect from the government, almost 20 years out in the cold. So having those government skills and coming from a background there, also combining it with an MBA and some commercial acumen, would see me, hold me in good stead. So that was the goal. I wasn't necessarily looking for a program that had a strong government focus, because I had that focus already. So I was looking for a program that would give me some really good technical skills and expose me to some really smart commercial people.
Right. So then, in terms of your shortlist, which became LBS and HKUST, why did you decide on those two schools as opposed to, say Oxford or Cambridge, or you already mentioned top schools in the U.S. being sort of out of the question because of your significant other. But I'm just curious, what was your logic there?
Well, for LBS, one of the great motivators for me was someone I was doing business with in Myanmar was an LBS alumni, actually, from 20 years ago. It was the Australian ambassador to Myanmar. And I really respected the way that he went about his work and the way he engaged with the private sector and the public sector and also the Myanmar government. And so, when you see case in point of an alumni doing work that you really admire and aspire to do, it's pretty easy to get some good to look highly upon the degree and the program. So that's one of the reasons. Another of the reasons is a lot of the European schools are now doing 12-month programs, and coming from a background in government without too much commercial experience and too much technical experience, I was looking for 2 years, close to 2 years, so I could really build those skills and develop where I wanted to. And then HKUST was quite an obvious choice in the Asian region, being a really top school in Asia. And obviously we can talk about it later, but I actually spoke to more alumni and admissions staff at HKUST and was really struck by the energy of HKUST that made me apply there as well.
Yeah, so, okay, that's great. So that's kind of the first section in terms of exploring and researching schools. And just to sum up some of the takeaways, Ben, I really like how, because you're from that public policy government background, how you actively reached out to your friends that live in the business world, right? To start to get their opinion of what schools matter. That's so smart, to talk to people in the business world, and then even further in the industries that you want to get into. And I think it's very clear when you were describing, what your post-MBA goals were. That's a great case study for our listeners in terms of how they can present their career goals very clearly and compellingly. And then when you do that, and when you have such a clear direction, it's a lot easier for people to help you and point you in the right direction. And it's also a lot easier for you to shortlist those schools. And I think, when I asked you what 20% of your research activities made the most difference, your answer is basically like work harder, like soak it all in, do all this stuff. Yeah. But to be honest, that's what you have to do to really, like you said, breathe the process and really kind of understand the energy of the schools and and what they really stand for and their structures and the people and everything. It is a lot of work. Yeah. There's no shortcuts.
Exactly. And it really holds you in good stead for the interview process.
Yes.
Which I can talk about later if you wish as well.
Yeah, let's talk about that now. So the second part, in terms of reaching out to students in schools, I want to give a shout out to one of our listeners, Matthew, who recently wrote me. And Matthew said, I listen to your podcast frequently, etc. But he had this one question I have not stumbled across while listening to your podcast, was whether you had any tips on what are appropriate questions to ask MBA alumni and admissions committee personnel. You mentioned reaching out to alumni and admissions often in your podcasts, and I was just curious if you had any advice on what are good questions to ask. So I definitely have some ideas, but I think, Ben, you've lived through this. So let's start there. How can we help Matthew out, and what did you do?
Okay, so I think my interaction with alumni, staff, and current students is important as well. It was was it 2 phases or 3? There was more than one phase, let's put it that way. So there was the interactions that I had with very senior people within my network, country managers, ambassadors, where you didn't want to ask about, how was the networking drinks on the Friday, or how was Sundowners, or how was the recruitment out of there, because it wasn't applicable anymore. These were very senior people. So for them, I approached them in a way much more conversationally and said, "Oh, I understand that you went to LBS or you went to this other business school. Did you have a generally positive experience? Would you recommend it for me? This is what I do and this is what I want to do. And would it be something that I really benefit from?" And the response was typically a paragraph or, in passing conversation. And it was always the same. It was always, "I loved it. People from our background most definitely will get great benefit out of it." So that helps to build your case as to why you should do it, and in your mind more than anything. And then there was the interactions that I had with current students, and current students were really important. So I had 2 friends that had undertaken the process of applying at LBS. One of them had also applied at Columbia in the US. So that was a bit out for me. But I really just used them as a sounding board as to how they approached it. But I used it more so about talking about myself and talking about my story and just seeing their reactions these were friends of mine, so I didn't need to. We could just have a normal conversation about it. I didn't have to prepare questions or anything like that, and didn't have to worry about talking about myself too much. They were very helpful and there to help me. So putting out my story while they knew it at a high level, talking about what I did on a day-to-day basis, see if it resonated with them, and it did. And some parts didn't resonate. My work in education didn't kind of hit the high notes that I was hoping for, but my Myanmar work was really exciting, and they were more interested in how we formed it and how the business was going and what the turnover was. And so that kind of helped me to get the story in my mind even more. And then I also used those two as when they moved over there and they'd begun the program in the early stages when I was applying, ask, so mate, what are you doing this week? And they were doing the leadership launch, where they have a look at, they do a 360 degree review of your management style and your working style. And the one at Columbia was heading out on a trek over to the West Coast. So these were all really interesting tidbits and things that are absolutely invaluable for when you approach admission staff, or when you have a conversation with the admission staff, or when you go into an interview with the admission staff. And it's those anecdotes that I used in my interview and in my application that really gave weight to the fact that, yeah, I do want to go to this school because I'm really passionate about it. I'm really excited to engage in these activities. So yeah, that's very, very helpful.
And so, no, I love, that's such good advice. It's almost like, this is kind of maybe a strange analogy, but it's like a stand-up comic, and you're trying out your material in front of different audiences to see exactly what works and what doesn't. And what better to do that with good friends who are current MBA students and even better at your target schools. I think that's such a good idea. So, people just really need to get out of their own heads and get out there and tell their story and see what resonates. As you said, I think that's great advice. And if you can't do that with a friend, you can find a consultant or someone else to help you. But how did you do that with HKUST? Because I'm assuming you didn't know anyone there.
No, I didn't know anyone there. So what I did with HKUST is just what everyone else would do, and approach them. Actually, I approached them via LinkedIn. And I think LinkedIn is just, if you're applying to an MBA and your LinkedIn isn't up to scratch, or it just doesn't have the most recent things on it, that's the first thing you need to do. You need to get that into shape, because it's a really useful networking tool, and it's the first thing that they'll see when they look you up, or when they see that you've reached out to them. So get that in order. So make sure you do your research before you approach someone. So at HKUST, I really did my research on the staff, and so I looked at what their background was. So I had an hour call with a HKUST admission staff who was also an alumni, and so that really interested me as well. And so I looked at this staff member and former alumni, and looked at what her background was and what really interested me. I wonder if she listens to the podcast, because she had a really profound effect on why I applied there. But she'd worked at LinkedIn, and also worked in the NBA, and I just tried to find some common ground. And I wasn't too focused on the conversation, because the conversation would flow. But I just wanted to try and find some common ground. So I talked about how I really enjoyed playing basketball, and tell me about how the program helped you get that job, and what about the program was beneficial for you taking it into that workplace. And so you use their background to guide the conversation, to get an understanding of the program. That's what I did. I didn't have any formal structured questions apart from the very obvious ones, like what's the best part of the program. Those questions are good when you haven't done your research. But if you've done your research and you can connect their background to their experience in the MBA, that gives you the inside edge, and it gives you a really good understanding of the program itself and how it's benefited them and why it might benefit you.
That's really smart. And did you talk to like any other students or alumni, or did you focus?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Yes, I did. So after speaking to that admissions staff, she offered to put me in contact with an Australian who'd done the program in the same year as her, and have a chat there. And I did that. And with that, I was looking for a little bit more of a personal insight into the program, rather than curriculum based or program structure based. So talked about an Australian moving from Australia to Hong Kong and what that was like, and if this person moved over with a partner and what the career prospects for those partners were and how easy they found it to live there, and then talked about the work-life balance and those kinds of things. So it's much more beneficial to talk on a personal level about their experience rather than getting too focused on the program structure or whatnot. Because I found that if you're applying to a top business school, they're teaching you very similar things at all of these schools. So the real difference is the engagement and the personal level, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious, how much of, you've done all this work, you've spoken with admission staff, a student there at these various schools, and then how much did you use those information sessions in your application?
I used them a lot. In fact, I also approached another person from HKUST via email because we couldn't work out a time to it was mutually convenient to have a Skype conversation, and he was extremely helpful in providing feedback. And the way I did that was, again, through some material that I found on the internet, and there was a short video of this alumni, and I was really taken by the way he spoke about the program. It was very very concise, but also spoke very eloquently, and obviously was passionate about it. So I linked in that person's name and reached out from there. And in that case, I used some more general questions about the program itself, which are very helpful for the application, because you can demonstrate that you have an understanding. So in that case, I talked about what the benefits of the program, being a very small program, was. What the quality of the candidates were like, and if there was an upward curve there, and what his friends ended up doing, and if they ended up in Hong Kong or elsewhere in Asia. And so, for example, I really used one of his responses in my application because he talked about how he really felt like the benefit of the program, being a small and relatively new program, was that he had a real chance to make a difference and to influence the program's direction. And that's something that really struck me and was really exciting about it. So I used a bit of that in crafting why I wanted to go there and why I wanted to be involved in having an influence on the program. So yeah, having those more structured questions are really helpful as well. And saying that this and don't feel afraid to actually drop the name in the application. I did that and said, this person told me this, and this is why it'll be beneficial for me. Or in speaking with this person, I've got this information. The admission staff, through all my conversations with them, from listening to podcasts, they actually encourage you to do it. So don't feel bad, just do it.
Yeah, and I think when I'm really getting from the lessons you've learned and I agree with them, is that it's both being strategic and tactical in terms of who you're approaching and what questions you're asking, but there is also kind of a brute force hard work aspect to it, where setting up these calls and meeting different people and I mean, it's a lot of work, but the benefit of putting in all that preparation is not only does it show through in your application, in terms of what you can write about and your knowledge of the program and how it fits your story and what you want to do, but also and this is where I think it's even more important as an admissions person, is the interviews, because you can just tell, right? Like when I was interviewing applicants, I could tell it's pretty clear which ones are really interested in your school. It's just because that volume of work and questions and interviews and research just comes out. It just comes out of your pores, like you said. You breathed it. So I'm sure that during your interviews, or correct me if I'm wrong, like did you also have chances to talk about the research you did during your interviews?
Oh, certainly, most definitely. The interviews ask you why you want to go to this school, and you would be silly to not use anecdotes about from when you've talked to students in the application, and it's the small things. I'll give you an example. I was speaking to this person I got on really well in the admissions office at HKUST, and I got the call that I was going to have an interview, and I said, okay, terrific. And they'll send me the details in the email. So they sent me the details in the email. And it didn't say who I was going to be talking with. So I called the person that I the contact I had and had a good relationship with, and I said, can you just let me know who the person is? And she did that. She gave me the name. That it's not a secret process. That they want to help you.
Yes.
And so they gave me the name, and the first thing I said in the interview was, hi Gary, how are you? And it was, how did you know it was? Well, I spoke to Phoebe about it, and she told me that you were the person that was going to be interviewing me, and that just gets you off on the right foot. And you've done the research on the person, and you know that they were an alumni as well, and now they're doing the interviews. So those small things, you cannot underestimate how important they are. Also, it's got to go with your story, and you've got to know why you actually want to do it. You can't just make it up. But those things are really important. And like I said in the LBS interview, I spent, that was a long interview. That was 3 hours, and I spent a lot of the
3 hours. Are you kidding me?
It was extensive, but it was because it was a conversation, and
that's a good sign. If an alum or student's willing to, or admissions officer is spending 3 hours with you. I'm sure the alum wanted to go back to work, but I wasn't too keen to. Being in Australia, there's not many people applying with you. You maybe in other countries you've got that kind of camaraderie of people you can talk to, but no one really understands it here when you're doing it by yourself. So having the opportunity to speak to someone who's actually involved in the process was a really exciting one, and one that I didn't want to give up. Yeah, absolutely. And it's very clear that each person you spoke with, you did your background research on them. I mean, that's a consistent tactic or strategy you used, and it's so important. So you get the most out of the conversation, and you impress them as well at the same time. Now, in terms of kind of this final stage, what I call polishing your application, I should say that we did work together briefly to do a brief review on your application. What did you take most from our app review session in terms of presenting your strongest story?
I'd just like to qualify that before I sent my app to Darren, I had sent it to I'd worked on it with at least 5 or 6 other people, my friends, people that I worked with, my fiance, current students that were at the schools that I wanted to be at, and they had helped me absolutely no end. I mean, you've got all the pieces there yourself. It's just about bringing the right anecdotes to the front and framing it in the right way.
And I have to say, having the courage to do that's big. For some applicants, that's no big deal, to share your application with your fiance and colleagues and so forth. But I think for a lot of applicants, it's a scary thing. I mean, you're putting tons of effort into this, and some people are more private. They don't want to share it with others. But I cannot overemphasize this enough, what you did and getting that story out and letting other people give you some feedback on it.
It's your story, and you need to be confident in your story and what you're talking about. And I was lucky because I had quite a unique story that had a number of anecdotes that were quite different. So it was easier for me to have a bit more of a wow factor in terms of the application. But, I had significant negatives as well in terms of, a below average GPA and GMAT for that instance. So, there are always pluses and negatives in your application. So it's about, and my work with Darren was more about what should we bring to the front and how do we highlight my positive aspects rather than dwell on the negatives. Because I think, you do a lot of research and it's very, very easy to get discouraged from applying to the schools you want to go to. Thinking, oh, well, I've got this one mark on my resume, or I've got this one mark on my transcript, and my extracurriculars aren't up to what I'm reading on Poets and Quants or something.
Tell me about it.
How am I gonna get in? One thing that was really, really stood out to me, and it still does, was I heard or I read a blog where an admissions director said they're looking for students that glow. They're not looking for students that have, that got an 800 GMAT and work at best.
Well, let me put it this way: we certainly wouldn't turn those people down, but
we wouldn't turn those people down. Those
to be clear, but
those aren't the normal. So they're looking for you to own your story and speak about it with passion and drive as to why you want to do an MBA. So that was a real priority in my application. Talking about what my interest was. Don't hide away from the fact that I had a government background, that I started a not-for-profit, that my story was a bit different, and try and glow in that way. And I think working with professionals or working with friends and family or people in the industry is so beneficial, because they can tell you if it glows or not. They'll read it, and if they're not interested, that you'll know. So that's one way to really get your story out and get it refined.
So just to give one specific example, and Ben, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but in your CV, you mentioned that you were the chief representative for Australia, for the Australia-Myanmar Chamber of Commerce. And I remember saying, didn't you co-found this thing? Why didn't you want to say that? And I think this is part of you owning your story, right? In terms of what you were able to do and talking more about all the work that went into that, co-founding this Chamber of Commerce in a very exciting developing country, Myanmar, which obviously is kind of the centerpiece of your profile. At least in my opinion, it was.
Yeah, it's easy to lose, not see the wood for the trees. Like when you're in the application process yourself, and you assume that most people understand that you were the co-founder, or that what process went involved to getting to where you are now. So you're right, Darren. So I focused heavily on the final outcome. So we represent $120 billion worth of market cap in Australia. We've met with this person and that person, and we're doing great things. But the really interesting part was, those were all great, but the really interesting part that you brought to the front was, we put together a board of really high-level people, and how do we do that without any background in doing this? And how do we encourage people to get on board, and how do we generate the money to hire a CEO? And as it all built up to the final outcome, we included as well, which was really gave a bit more of that glow and a bit more of the story that we were looking for.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway here is to get a lot of eyes on your story, and like Ben said, own your story, but see what glows, what works. I think that's such great advice. Ben, any last tips that come to mind that really helped you that you'd like to share with the audience?
I mean, I think I've given plenty of tips, but I would just talk about morale through the process. Like, it is an incredibly stressful process that people, if you're not applying, don't understand. You say you're applying to these schools, and they assume that you've made it into these schools, that it's done. It's a done thing, because they just don't quite understand the rigorous process. You say, oh, it's only 2 recommendation letters, and and a couple of essays and a CV, and you're off. You're done. But you put so much effort in to crafting it and to getting in that it is really stressful. So I think perseverance is really important. Don't get discouraged. I would one day I would feel great about my chances of getting into any school in the world, and the next day I'd think, well, I'm not going to get in anywhere. I need to look down the list. I didn't do as well on the GMAT as I wanted to. I need to go and retake that 7 more times or whatever it was. So really focus on the positives. If you do the research and if you show passion to get into the school, I think that's a long way. It goes a long way to getting into where you want. And if you really do have a passion for it, I just feel like it'll work out. So keep going.
If I may take that one level further, like, how did you stay balanced?
I say you've got to live and breathe it, but obviously there are times when you've got to put it on the back burner and focus on something else. At the beginning of my journey, I did a lot of research on blogs and in forums and on popular MBA sites, and I found that they were more discouraging than anything. Just in terms of, the ding list was always an interesting one to read about these perfect people that didn't get in. So I just tried to just feel confident in my own story. I was happy with what I was doing, and the people, the alumni that I was speaking to, seemed excited by my story and seemed excited by the prospect of me going to their schools. So it's just about having some self-confidence and realizing that these forums and and websites don't represent the vast majority of the people that go to these schools. They're just normal people that worked hard to get there, and if you work hard, I think you can get there. Just have a bit of just be a bit even keeled and realize that it's not the end of the world.
No, I think you make a really good point, which is, it's one thing to be completely overwhelmed after reading these forums and ding lists that you see online, but maybe the best thing to focus on is, of course, your own research and your story, but getting that in front of real people that that real students.
Exactly.
Not online chatter. Real students, real alumni, real people.
Exactly.
See what they have to say. And I think that's one way to kind of keep, steer the ship in the right direction and not get too overwhelmed. So great advice, Ben. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I know it's been a long journey for you. I want to say congratulations again. I'm so excited for you. And I definitely will be having you on the podcast again as a student. I think it'd be really interesting to kind of track your journey as a student and then an alumni and see how things change and so forth. So congratulations again, and I know you're going to get married soon, and I'm just really excited for you. So awesome.
Thanks, Darren. I've really got to thank you for having me and letting me tell a bit of my story. As the Touch MBA podcast has been really helpful in, as I said, getting my thoughts in order and making sure that I apply for the right schools for me. And it's an absolutely invaluable free resource that I would just, encourage more and more people to get involved and to do their research through that means. So thanks a lot, Darren.